The movie begins with a view of a castle on a mountain. An elderly woman looks at it through a window on a winter evening. She is putting her granddaughter to bed, but the girl asks her to explain why it snows. Settling comfortably, the woman begins her tale, saying it all started long ago with a pair of scissors owned by a man who lived in the castle on the mountain. The story takes us back in time. On a warm, sunny day, Mrs. Peg Boggs is walking through a well-maintained suburb. She is an Avon representative, offering beauty products to housewives, but they ignore her out of habit, buying nothing. Frustrated by another failure, she notices the castle on the mountain in her rearview mirror, towering over the idyllic suburb with its colorful houses. She decides to go there, hoping to make at least one sale. Climbing the slope, she finds a beautiful, well-kept garden. She knocks on the door, but no one answers. A true sales agent is not deterred by silence. Mrs. Boggs enters the castle, searching for a potential customer. Upstairs, in an attic with a roof weathered by time and storms, she discovers a strange, shaggy man in a black suit with giant scissors for hands. Frightened, she wants to flee, but he asks her to stay. His father, or rather, his creator, an old scientist, has passed away, leaving the man named Edward alone in the castle. The woman notices multiple cuts on his face from the blades and applies healing cream before inviting the strange man to her home. On the way, Edward, who has never left the castle, looks around the suburb with great curiosity, seeing it up close for the first time. Meanwhile, the local housewives notice him in Mrs. Boggs' car and rush to gossip about the mysterious guest over the phone. At home, the hostess shows Edward family photos, including one of her daughter, Kim. The girl is currently on a camping trip but will return soon. Mrs. Boggs provides Edward with pants and a shirt from her husband's wardrobe to help him blend in, as his gothic black suit looks more suited to a resurrected rock musician than a harmless oddball. While helping him change and repair accidentally cut clothing, the neighbors gather outside, gossiping about what's happening until their husbands return from work. During dinner, Mrs. Boggs introduces Edward to her husband, Bill, and son, Kevin. They are surprised by the unusual visitor, while Edward struggles to eat with utensils due to his scissor hands. Nonetheless, they are quite welcoming. The next morning, as all the husbands drive off to work in unison, the bored housewives once again flock to Mrs. Boggs' house, eager to meet the new addition to their small community. Meanwhile, Edward is in the yard, sculpting a dinosaur from a bush and then creating a likeness of the family that took him in. His talent amazes the head of the household, who is relieved to be spared the tedious chore of yard work. However, one neighbor, a devout and slightly eccentric woman, spies on Edward and calls him a demon and a messenger of hell. The family dismisses her as they prepare for a party. Edward's mechanical skills come in handy for slicing vegetables. During these tasks, Edward has flashbacks of intricate machines, akin to Rube Goldberg devices, that his inventor father had built in the castle before creating Edward himself. At the party, Edward is a hit. The locals eagerly get to know him, while the bored housewives secretly gossip about him behind their husbands' backs. After a day full of events, Edward rests in a bedroom, sprawled on a waterbed. He cannot sleep due to overwhelming memories. Edward recalls the inventor who taught and assembled him piece by piece. His thoughts are interrupted by Kim's return. She is dropped off near the house by friends, including her boyfriend, Jim. The girl doesn't notice Edward right away but screams in terror upon seeing him, waking the entire household. Bill takes Edward to the basement, where he has a bachelor's den, and offers him some alcohol to calm his nerves. When Kim's mother brings her down to meet Edward, he is already drunk and passes out on the spot. The next day, Edward uses his gardening skills at the home of a neighbor named Joyce, whose libido drives her to flirt with every new man in the neighborhood. However, Edward is more concerned with the aftereffects of his drinking. He's experiencing a hangover. Edward's talent for crafting intricate topiary sculptures earns him admiration among the local residents. However, Kim still keeps her distance from the new family member, finding his awkward behavior unsettling and his presence out of place in normal company. It soon becomes clear that Edward also has a knack for grooming. He trims the fur of a neighbor's poodle with extraordinary ease. Joyce seizes the opportunity to get a haircut herself. The result exceeds all expectations, and soon the local women line up for haircuts, replacing their pets in the queue. Even Mrs. Boggs gets her turn, ensuring Edward's scissor hands remain in working condition. One of the neighbors drives Edward to a shopping mall to have his blade sharpened. During the trip, Edward spots Kim with her friends, but she doesn't notice him. Upon returning home, Edward finds Kim and Jim locked out of the house. Kim has lost her key, and Edward uses one of his scissor fingers to pick the lock. revealing yet another useful skill. Soon, Edward's newfound fame as a stylist leads to an invitation to appear on a television show. During the broadcast, he answers questions, expressing his happiness about his new friends and the purpose he has found among people. He is also encouraged to open his own beauty salon, where his talents could not only be appreciated but also bring financial success. One of the show's guests asks Edward if he has a girlfriend. He hesitates to answer, and back home, Kim watches the show with her brother and Jim, anxiously waiting for his response. Before Edward can say anything, he accidentally cuts the microphone cord and gets an electric shock. After the show, Edward and Joyce visit a shopping mall to inspect a potential space for his salon. Joyce shows Edward the main hall and then leads him into a back room, where she attempts to seduce him. However, a falling chair disrupts her advances and Edward escapes, confused and uncomfortable. He later joins the Boggs family for dinner, mentioning the salon space and vaguely referencing Joyce's strange behavior, which he doesn't fully understand. Unfortunately, Edward's plans to open a business fall through. The bank denies him a loan for the initial capital. Mrs. Boggs comforts him, assuring him they'll find another way to get the money. Meanwhile, Jim, frustrated by his father's refusal to buy him a car, devises a cunning plan. He intends to use Edward's lockpicking skills to rob his own house and steal expensive video equipment. Edward breaks into the house and gains access to the equipment room, but the alarm suddenly goes off, trapping him inside. Jim and his accomplices flee despite Kim's protests to stay and help Edward. The police arrive, disable the alarm, and order the intruder to come out. Edward complies, but the sight of his scissor hands almost leads to a tragic misunderstanding. The officers nearly open fire, but are stopped by neighbors who explain that Edward's hands are not weapons but a unique feature of his body. Nonetheless, Edward is arrested and taken to the station. At the station, the Boggs family visits Edward. They believe he committed the crime to earn money for his salon. Trust in the peculiar newcomer begins to waver. Meanwhile, the neighbors gossip about Edward's supposed criminal tendencies, and Joyce adds fuel to the fire, portraying herself as a victim of an attempted assault. Kim doesn't admit that she was the one who asked Edward to participate in the scheme. Her friendship with Jim increasingly upsets Edward. Unable to contain his emotions, Edward slashes curtains and scratches the bathroom walls. During dinner, the family tries to address Edward's moral compass, but their efforts are ineffective. The parents remain unaware that he acted at Kim's request, rather than as a result of his own initiative. Meanwhile, Christmas approaches, and Mrs. Boggs prepares for the annual holiday party. However, the neighbors, still gossiping, express doubts about attending due to Edward's presence. That evening, as the family decorates the house and trims the Christmas tree, Edward carves an ice sculpture in the yard. The ice shavings swirl in the air like snowflakes, creating a snowfall in a place where it had never snowed before. Mesmerized by the sight, Kim dances under the man-made snowfall until Jim's voice distracts her. Startled, she accidentally grazes Edward's blades and gets a small cut on her hand. While she treats the wound inside, Jim confronts Edward and drives him away. When Kim learns what happened, she argues with Jim and breaks up with him. Edward, in a fit of anger, tears apart the clothes and hedges he had previously crafted, terrifying the neighbors, who call the police. Unable to find Edward nearby, Kim's father returns home to get his car and continues the search. The Boggs parents leave Kim alone at home, and Edward soon returns. Overjoyed to see him, Kim asks for a hug, but Edward hesitates, afraid of hurting her. Despite his reluctance, Kim insists and embraces him, triggering bittersweet memories. Edward recalls how his inventor had prepared human hands for him, but died of a heart attack before he could attach them. As they embrace by the window, Edward notices Jim's van swerving erratically down the road while Kim's younger brother, Kevin, approaches the house from the opposite direction, returning from a friend's place. Realizing the danger, Edward rushes outside just in time to save Kevin from being hit by the van. However, in the process, he accidentally scratches Kevin, which the neighbors witness as they gather in response to the commotion. They accuse Edward of intentionally harming the boy, and a drunken Jim attacks him. To defend himself, Edward uses his blades, further escalating the situation. The sound of police sirens fills the air. Kim, determined to protect Edward from the enraged crowd, urges him to flee. He obeys and runs back to the castle on the mountain. The sheriff fires warning shots into the air to scare the crowd and then leaves. But the angry mob decides to follow Edward to the castle. Kim manages to reach the castle first and finds Edward in the attic, where her mother had initially discovered him. However, Jim sneaks into the castle as well, bringing a revolver. He fires at Edward, but Kim intervenes, knocking the weapon out of his hands. Even without the gun, Jim continues to attack Edward, using anything at his disposal. Kim tries to stop him, striking him with a wooden beam. Ignoring her pleas to end the fight, Jim pushes her aside and turns his fury back on Edward. In a desperate move, Edward gets to his feet and thrusts his scissor hands into Jim's chest, fatally wounding him. He then pushes Jim's body out of the window, where it falls to the ground below. From the attic, Kim and Edward watch as the angry mob approaches the castle gates, thirsting for vengeance. They say their goodbyes, and Kim kisses Edward one last time before descending to meet the crowd. On her way down, she grabs one of the inventor's spare prosthetic hands. Confronting the mob, she shows them the prosthetic and claims that Edward and Jim died in a fight that caused the ceiling to collapse, crushing them both. Satisfied with her explanation, the neighbors disperse and return to their homes to celebrate Christmas. The story shifts back to the elderly woman and her granddaughter. The grandmother admits that she never saw Edward again. She knows he is still alive, living alone in the castle on the mountain. She explains that ever since Edward entered her life, it has snowed every Christmas, something that never happened before he appeared. In the final scene, Edward, dressed in his black suit, is seen in the dilapidated attic of the castle. He uses his scissor hands to carve ice sculptures, sending shavings through the hole in the roof. The ice particles drift down like snowflakes, blanketing the suburb below, where the townsfolk celebrate another Christmas. The movie ends with this magical snowfall. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.